theme, the Holy Grail, is actually spiritual.
Oh yes. Path? Oh, the Holy Grail is not an object. Let me explain. 40 or 50 years after the foundation of the Knights Templar, which sprang from a group of knights in the county of Champagne in northeastern France, another man from the same area and from the same group of families wrote a book called Le Comte de Grail. It's somewhat incomplete, and his name was Chrétien Letoile. This was followed up some years later by a man who may have been a Templar Knight, but nobody's too sure of that, a wonderful German gentleman called Wolfram von Essenbach. And he wrote a complete story called Parzival. And this described a rather simple, well-intentioned young knight searching out for a holy relic. Now, my first literary collaborator was a wonderful man called Trevor Ravenscroft, and he wrote a sort of cult best-selling book called The Spear of Destiny. But his much more important book was a book called The Cup of Destiny, wherein he translated von Essenbach's Parzival as a guide, a coded guide to initiation. Because at the time Parzival was written, to suggest initiation or search for sacred knowledge would have been regarded as heresy. And you'd have been invited to the next church barbecue, only you'd have been on the menu. So people had to disguise things in code, both artistically and literally. Now, I wasn't totally convinced the first time I read Trevor's book. And then a man for whom I had developed enormous respect over the years, an American professor called Joseph Campbell, who wrote very, very wonderful work, very perceptive work about mythology and spiritual traditions. He was asked in a television series called The Power of Myth, "What is the Holy Grail?" And he laughed. And he answered by posing a question. He said, why should any medieval knight set out on a perilous search for any relic, however holy, when if he wanted a miracle, tied up with Jesus, all he had to do was cross the road and go to church and take communion? Because according to the belief system of the time, he was partaking directly of the body and blood of Jesus. He said, no, it was a coded guide to spiritual enlightenment. And that's what the Grail is. And for those of us who have sought it and found it, our lives have been transformed. And the wonderful thing is it's open to anybody. You don't have to be special. You don't have to isolate yourself from reality to follow it. You can live in the real world as it is. And by learning how to apply the knowledge and principles you acquire on the path, your life will change dramatically for the better. And that's not theory. That's actually happened to me and to many, many others.
But what do you have to do to actually find that path?
A little bit of prayer and meditation on a regular and disciplined basis, and you become open to it. The teaching does not come from your spiritual guide or mentor. They teach you the methodology, which opens your spirit, and the teaching comes direct. It's rather like getting a download on the computer. Okay. That's probably the nearest analogy you can think of.